August 26, 1946, a Monday, late summer in Los Angeles. The war was over. Had been for a year now, and America was trying to figure out what came next. At 20th Century Fox, a young woman walked through the main gates. She was 20 years old. Her name was Norma Jeane Dougherty. But that wasn't who she wanted to be. She had another name picked out, Marilyn Monroe. Today she was here to sign a contract, a real studio contract. 6 months guaranteed at $125 a week. A real chance. After all the rejections, all the almosts. Finally, someone was saying yes. Dim those lights. Get comfortable. Because we're about to take a journey. Back through time, to understand how a girl named Norma Jeane became Marilyn Monroe. How loneliness became ambition. How pain became beauty. How desperation became stardom. But before we get to that August afternoon, we need to go back further. Back to the beginning. Back to a girl who never knew her father, whose mother couldn't take care of her, who grew up in a dozen different homes, who learned early that the only person she could count on was herself. Chapter 1. Norma Jeane, June 1st, 1926, Los Angeles County Hospital, a charity hospital. In a ward with a dozen other women, Gladys Pearl Monroe gave birth to a daughter. They named her Norma Jeane Mortensen. Her real father was probably a man named Charles Stanley Gifford, but he denied paternity, wanted nothing to do with her. So Norma Jeane was born with no father at all, just a mother who was already struggling. Gladys was 24 years old, working long hours at a film studio, struggling with depression and the voices in her head, so she made a decision. She would place Norma Jeane with a foster family, just temporarily, just until she got on her feet. Norma Jeane was 12 days old when Gladys brought her to the Bolender house in Hawthorne, promised to visit, promised to take her back soon. But days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years. The Bolender household was strict, very strict. Pentecostal Christians, church, prayer, rules, structure. There were other foster children rotating through, but Norma Jeane stayed, year after year, because Gladys kept paying, kept promising, but soon never came. Norma Jeane was a quiet child, shy, withdrawn. She learned early not to make trouble, not to need too much. She did her chores, went to church, followed the rules, was forgettable, just another foster kid. But inside, she was lonely, desperately lonely. She wanted her mother, wanted to understand why Gladys didn't take her back. What was wrong with her? Why wasn't she enough? Gladys did visit occasionally every few months, looking glamorous and distant. She'd take Norma Jeane out for ice cream or to the movies, make promises, and then disappear again, back to her life. And Norma Jeane would be left with hope that slowly curdled into disappointment. The movies became Norma Jeane's escape, her magic. Gladys worked in the film industry, cutting reels. Sometimes she'd bring home posters or photographs. Norma Jeane would stare at them for hours. Jean Harlow, Greta Garbo, Carol Lombard. These women were perfect, loved. They were who Norma Jeane wanted to be. In 1933, when Norma Jeane was 7, Gladys decided she was ready. She bought a small house in Hollywood. Finally, after 7 years, Norma Jeane moved in with her mother. But it wasn't wonderful. They didn't know each other, were like strangers, and Gladys was getting worse. Her mental health was deteriorating. She'd have episodes, days where she couldn't get out of bed, moments of paranoia. Then, in January 1934, Gladys had a complete breakdown. She was hospitalized, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, committed. And just like that, after only 8 months, Norma Jeane was alone again. She was placed with Grace McKee, a family friend. But Grace couldn't keep her indefinitely. So the search began for another foster home. The next several years were a blur of different homes, different families. She went to the Los Angeles Orphans Home Society for over a year, then more foster homes, never staying long enough to put down roots, never feeling like she belonged. She learned to adapt, to read people, to figure out what they wanted and give it to them, to be whatever version of herself they needed. She became a shapeshifter, a performer, playing whatever role was required to survive. School was hard. She moved so often, she was always the new girl. But she was pretty. Even as a child, you could see it, and as she hit puberty, that quality intensified. Boys noticed, men noticed. She learned that her appearance had power. In 1942, when Norma Jeane was 16, Grace McKee was getting remarried, couldn't take Norma Jeane with her, so Grace suggested an alternative. There was a young man, Jim Dougherty, 21 years old, nice, stable. Why not get married? Norma Jeane was 16, still in high school, but the alternative, another foster home, was unthinkable. So she said yes, agreed to marry a man she barely knew. They were married on June 19th, 1942. She wore a borrowed white dress, smiled for photographs, and inside she felt nothing, just relief that she had somewhere to go. She became Norma Jeane Dougherty, dropped out of school, tried to be a wife, cooked, cleaned, waited, it was safe, stable, boring, suffocating. She was still lonely, still dreaming of being someone else. Chapter 2. Discovery. In the spring of 1944, Jim shipped out, sent to the Pacific Theater, and Norma Jeane was alone. She needed a job. Grace helped her get hired at the Radioplane Company in Burbank, a defense plant. They made target drones, assembly line work. Norma Jeane worked in the dope room, spraying liquid plastic on fabric parts. Hot work, chemical smelling. But the pay was decent, $20 a week. Then, in June 1944, something happened that changed everything. A photographer came to the plant. His name was David Conover, Army photographer. His assignment was simple: take photographs for Yank magazine, morale-boosting images, pretty girls doing war work. Conover walked through the factory, looking for the right girl, and then he saw her, Norma Jeane. Something about her stopped him. There was a quality, a luminosity. This was it. This was the girl. He posed her, had her hold different parts, smile at the camera, and something magical happened. When she looked at the lens, something changed. She became confident, radiant. The camera loved her. When the session was over, Conover told her something that would echo in her mind. "You should consider modeling," he said. "You could make real money. You've got the look." Norma Jeane couldn't stop thinking about it. Modeling, a career, a way out. A few weeks later, Conover came back, wanted to shoot her again, properly photographed. They met on a weekend. He photographed her for hours. The photographs were stunning. This girl was a natural. Norma Jeane started modeling part-time, on weekends, after work, small jobs, print ads, catalog work, but it was adding up, creating opportunities. In early 1945, she quit Radioplane, decided to pursue modeling full-time. It was a risk, but it felt right. She signed with the Blue Book Modeling Agency, run by Emmeline Snively. Miss Snively saw potential, but also rough edges. "Your hair," she said, "it needs to be lighter. Blonde photographs better." Norma Jeane went to the salon, hours under the dryer. When they were done, her hair was golden, platinum. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. This wasn't Norma Jeane Dougherty. This was someone else. The blonde hair changed everything. More jobs came, better jobs. She was booking multiple shoots a week, making real money, appearing on magazine covers. Her marriage to Jim was falling apart. He came back from the war expecting his wife, but she wasn't that girl anymore. She told him about her plans. He didn't understand, didn't like it, wanted her to stop, but she couldn't. She'd tasted freedom, possibility. For the first time, she was choosing, and she wasn't going to give it up. By late 1945, Norma Jeane had moved out. Jim filed for divorce in 1946. She didn't contest it, just let that chapter close. She was 19, divorced, alone, but this time, alone felt like freedom. Chapter 3, Becoming Marilyn. The name came first. Norma Jeane Dougherty didn't sound like a star. She needed something that sounded like stardom, like destiny. The Monroe part came from her mother, Gladys's maiden name. The first name was harder. Then someone suggested Marilyn. After Marilyn Miller, the Broadway star, Marilyn Monroe. It had rhythm. It felt right. She started using it for modeling jobs, testing it, and it worked. It fit. But a name alone wasn't enough. The transformation required more. Her teeth, she got them fixed, straightened, whitened. Her voice, she worked on it, lowered it, more sensual. Her walk, she developed her own style, confident but feminine. Her makeup, she became an expert, could transform herself from ordinary to extraordinary. She studied other actresses obsessively, Jean Harlow especially, watched how she moved, how she used her sexuality as a tool. She learned that in Hollywood you had to be a brand, a product, a carefully constructed fantasy, and slowly, deliberately, she built that brand, built Marilyn Monroe, the sexy but innocent blonde. It was an act, a performance, but she played it so completely that the lines between Norma Jeane and Marilyn began to blur. By the summer of 1946, Marilyn Monroe was real, was known within the industry, was going places. She'd been doing screen tests whenever she could, and the tests were good. She saw it. Studio executives saw it. There was one executive who believed, who saw a star. His name was Ben Lyon, head of talent at 20th Century Fox, and when he saw Marilyn Monroe's screen test, he saw something special. Chapter 4, The Contract, August 26, 1946, the day we started with. Marilyn walked onto the Fox lot to sign her contract. The studio lot was impressive, enormous, sound stages, back lots, the commissary where stars ate. This was one of the big 5 studios. To have a contract here was to have made it. Ben Lyon greeted her warmly, told her how excited the studio was, how much they believed in her potential. The contract was standard, 6 months guaranteed at $125 a week, with options for renewal. Classes she'd have to take: acting, voice, dance. The studio would develop her. She signed the contract, her hand shaking slightly. Marilyn Monroe. That was who she was now, officially, legally, permanently. Lyon walked her around the lot, introduced her to people, showed her the sound stages, the commissary, that legendary place where stars ate lunch. Marilyn walked through in a daze, looking at famous faces, trying not to stare, trying to act like she belonged. But inside, she was still that little girl, watching movies, dreaming of this moment, and now here she was. The contract was signed. The studio owned her for 6 months. Their plan is to turn her into a star. And she was willing. She'd do anything, be anything, because this was her shot, her chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Chapter 5, The Price. The first few months at Fox were intoxicating. Marilyn threw herself into everything, attended every class, worked harder than anyone. They put her in her first film in early 1947. A tiny role, uncredited, 2 lines, 20 seconds of screen time, but it was something. More small roles followed, bit parts, background, mostly decoration. She went on dates with executives, producers, anyone who might help her career. This was part of the business. Beauty was currency. She'd learned to use it. The first 6 months ended. The studio renewed her option. She'd survived the first cut, but the roles weren't getting bigger. The studio didn't know what to do with her. In 1948, after 2 years, Fox let her go, dropped her option, just like that. She was unwanted again, rejected again. It was devastating, but Marilyn didn't give up. Columbia Pictures signed her in 1948, another 6-month contract, but it went the same way, small roles, then dropped again. The late 1940s were hard. She was broke most of the time, behind on rent. She modeled more, did risque shoots, posed nude for a calendar when desperate for rent money. $50, enough to survive another month. She was lonely, desperately lonely, had affairs, brief connections that promised something but delivered nothing. She started taking pills to help, to sleep, to wake up, to cope, to survive. Chapter 6. The future. Marilyn Monroe in August 1946 couldn't possibly imagine what was coming. Within a few years, everything would change. In 1950, she'd get noticed in the asphalt jungle, then All About Eve. In 1953, she'd become a star, a real star, with Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire. She was the most photographed woman in the world. She became everything she'd ever wanted, everything she'd dreamed of, but it wouldn't be enough. Nothing would fill the hole inside, the void from childhood. Fame couldn't fill it. Success couldn't fill it. Love couldn't fill it. She'd marry 3 times, to Joe DiMaggio, to Arthur Miller, seeking what she couldn't find in herself, but the marriages wouldn't work. She couldn't be fully herself with anyone. She'd make great films, some Like It Hot, The 7-Year Itch, proving she could act, but she'd also struggle. Miss days on set, show up late. The pills were part of it, the drinking, the mental illness she'd inherited from her mother. And then, August 5th, 1962, Sunday morning, Brentwood, California. She'd be found dead, barbiturates, too many pills. She'd be 36 years old. The world would mourn, but they weren't mourning the real person. They were mourning the fantasy, the image. Very few people knew the real woman, the Norma Jeane underneath. Her legacy would be complex. She'd become an icon, a symbol, her image everywhere. Marilyn Monroe reduced to image, to surface, to sexuality. But she'd also become a symbol of the price of fame, the cost of beauty, the sadness behind the smile, a cautionary tale. Standing in that studio office in August 1946, Marilyn couldn't know any of this, could only see hope, possibility, the dream within reach, and it did begin. That August afternoon, with a signature, with a choice to be Marilyn Monroe instead of Norma Jeane, to be chosen instead of invisible, to matter instead of disappear. And that's where we'll leave her tonight. Marilyn Monroe, 20 years old, standing in an office at Fox, signing her first contract, the door opening, the dream beginning. She couldn't know what was coming, the heights and depths, the triumphs and tragedies. But in that moment, she was happy, hopeful. After 20 years of foster homes and abandonment and rejection, finally, someone was saying yes, someone was choosing her. And maybe that's all any of us really want. To be seen, to be chosen, to matter, even if the cost is high, even if the dream consumes us. Marilyn Monroe got to live that dream, got to be famous, got to be loved by millions. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. These stories from Hollywood's past, they're still here, still teaching us that dreams have prices, that transformation requires sacrifice, that fame doesn't equal happiness, but they also remind us that dreams are possible, that unwanted girls can become icons, that somewhere over the rainbow, if you're willing to believe strongly enough, dreams really can come true. And may your transformations cost less than hers did. May you be seen for who you really are, instead of who you pretend to be. and may you find the peace that Marilyn Monroe never found. And that concludes another episode of Hollywood Insomniac. Soft stories for sleepless nights. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for extra content to help you doze off. Let me tell you more about that day in August 1946, that Monday when Norma Jeane walked onto the Fox lot to become Marilyn Monroe. She woke up early that morning, couldn't sleep anyway. Too nervous, too excited, too afraid it might all be a dream, that she'd wake up and it would all disappear, that the contract wasn't real, that nobody wanted her after all. She got up, made coffee in her tiny apartment. Black coffee. She couldn't afford milk, could barely afford the coffee. But she needed something to calm her nerves, something to wake her up, something to make her feel ready. She went to her closet, looked at the few dresses hanging there, picked the blue one. Simple but flattering. Professional. Not too sexy, not too plain, just right. She wanted to look like someone they'd made the right decision about. Someone who belonged at a studio, someone who could be a star. She did her makeup carefully. Foundation, powder, rouge on her cheeks. Lipstick. Red, but not too red. Mascara. She knew how to do her face now. Had learned through years of modeling. Knew what worked, what the camera liked, what made her look her best. Her hair, that blonde hair that had changed everything. She styled it carefully, curled it, made sure every strand was perfect, because you never knew who you might meet, what opportunity might present itself. You had to always be ready, always be on, always be Marilyn. She looked in the mirror, saw someone she barely recognized sometimes. This blonde woman in the nice dress with the perfect makeup and the styled hair. This wasn't Norma Jeane. Norma Jeane had mousy brown hair and hand-me-down clothes and no confidence. This was someone else, someone better, someone who could succeed, someone who could be chosen. She took the bus to the Fox lot, couldn't afford a car, barely could afford the bus fare. But she got there, walked through those gates. Security waved her through. Miss Monroe, they said. They knew her name, expected her. She was legitimate now, real, not just some girl with dreams, but someone with a contract, someone the studio wanted, someone who mattered. The lot was enormous, overwhelming. She'd been there before for the screen test, but this was different. This time she belonged. This time she wasn't just a hopeful. She was contract talent. She had a right to be there. She found Ben Lyon's office, knocked on the door, heart pounding, hands shaking. What if they'd changed their minds? What if they'd found someone better? What if this was all a mistake? But Ben opened the door, smiled, welcomed her in. Marilyn, he said, using her new name, her chosen name, making it real. We're so happy to have you. They sat down. He pulled out the contract, explained the terms. 6 months at $125 a week. Options to renew at higher rates if things went well. Classes she'd attend. The studio's expectations. Their investment in her. Their belief in her potential. She tried to listen, tried to focus, but her mind was racing. This was it. This was really happening. After years of rejection, after foster homes and poverty and being told she wasn't good enough, after modeling and screen tests and almosts, after believing and hoping and never giving up even when it seemed hopeless, after all of that, someone was finally saying yes. She picked up the pen, hand shaking, looked at the line where she needed to sign, saw her name there. Marilyn Monroe, not Norma Jeane Dougherty, not Norma Jean Mortensen, Marilyn Monroe. That was who she was now. That was who she was becoming. That was who she'd be from this moment forward. She signed, her signature shaky but legible. Marilyn Monroe, done, official, real. She was under contract. She was Fox talent. She was on her way. To what, she didn't exactly know, but somewhere better than where she'd been. Somewhere that had to be better than the life she was escaping. Ben Lyon congratulated her, shook her hand, told her again how much the studio believed in her, how hard they'd worked to make her a star, how excited everyone was. She nodded, smiled, thanked him, tried to act confident, professional, like this happened every day, like she belonged here, like she wasn't terrified and thrilled and overwhelmed all at once. He walked her around the lot, showed her the sound stages, enormous buildings, dark inside, but full of lights and cameras and sets. This was where the magic happened, where movies were made, where stars were born, where dreams came true or didn't, depending on luck, on talent, on timing, on 1,000 factors she couldn't control. He showed her the back lot, standing sets that looked like city streets, like small towns, like anywhere and everywhere, all of it fake, built, constructed, just like Marilyn Monroe was constructed, built from Norma Jeane, transformed through effort and will and need, made into something else, something better, something marketable. He took her to the commissary, the legendary Fox commissary, where stars ate lunch, where deals were made, where the hierarchy of Hollywood was visible, stars at the center tables, character actors at the edges, below-the-line workers in the far corner, everyone in their place, everyone knowing their status. Marilyn walked in, tried not to stare, but there they were, the faces from the screen, the people she'd watched in darkened theaters when she was a child, when she was lonely, when she was dreaming of escape, and now here she was, in the same room, eating the same food, part of the same world, almost, not quite yet, but getting there, getting closer, one step at a time. She got a sandwich, ham and cheese, simple, cheap, all she could afford from her daily allowance. Sat at a table near the edge, not too far in, not too far out, somewhere in between, watching, learning, seeing how it worked, how people interacted, who was important, who wasn't, who to talk to, who to avoid, the unspoken rules, the hidden hierarchies, the way Hollywood really worked. And she learned, absorbed it all, stored it away, for later, for when she needed it, for when she'd be sitting at those center tables, for when she'd be the star, the name, the one everyone wanted to sit with, talk to, be seen with. That was the goal, that was the dream, that was what all of this was for. After lunch, Ben took her to the talent department, introduced her to coaches, acting, voice, dance, the people who'd polish her, refine her, turn her from rough potential into finished product. From Marilyn Monroe, the model, into Marilyn Monroe, the actress, the star, the icon. They were polite, professional, but also assessing, judging, deciding how much work she'd need, how much potential she really had, whether the studio's investment would pay off, whether she could actually act, whether beauty would be enough, or whether she'd wash out like so many others, pretty girls who couldn't deliver, who looked good but couldn't perform, who failed and disappeared and were forgotten. She smiled, answered their questions, agreed to everything. Yes, she'd work hard. Yes, she'd attend every class. Yes, she'd do whatever was needed, because she would. She'd do anything, give anything, be anything, to make this work, to succeed, to become someone, to matter, to be enough. Finally, at last, after 20 years of not being enough, of being unwanted, of being forgotten, this was her chance to change all that, to become someone people wanted, someone people remembered, someone who mattered. The day ended. Ben walked her back to the gate, told her when to come back, when classes started, when she'd meet with publicity, when the studio would start building her, marketing her, creating the image, the brand, the fantasy, Marilyn Monroe, star, icon. She left the lot, walked out those gates, stood on the street, The sun was setting, the Los Angeles sky turning pink and orange and gold, beautiful, perfect, like a painting, like a movie, like the dream she'd been chasing. She thought about Norma Jeane, that scared little girl who'd grown up in foster homes, who'd never known her father, whose mother was locked away, who'd been told again and again that she wasn't enough, wasn't special, would never amount to anything. That little girl who'd watched movies in the dark and dreamed of being someone else, someone better, someone chosen, and now, here, 20 years later, that dream was starting to come true. Norma Jeane was disappearing, Marilyn was emerging, the transformation was happening, the escape was real. She'd gotten out, away from the past, away from the pain, away from being unwanted. She was chosen now, wanted now, had a contract, had a studio, had a future. Or did she? Because somewhere inside, deep inside where Marilyn couldn't quite reach, Norma Jeane was still there, still scared, still lonely, still believing she wasn't enough, still waiting to be found out, to be discovered as a fraud, to be sent away, back to the foster homes, back to nowhere, back to being unwanted, back to being nothing. But she pushed that voice away, silenced it, buried it, became Marilyn, because Marilyn was strong, Marilyn was confident, Marilyn was going to be a star, Marilyn was going to succeed, Marilyn was enough, had to be enough, because the alternative, going back to being Norma Jeane, that was unthinkable, unbearable, impossible. So she walked to the bus stop, got on the bus, rode home to her tiny apartment, and for one night, one perfect night, she let herself believe, let herself hope, let herself feel that maybe, just maybe, this time it would work, this time she'd make it, this time the dream would come true, this time she'd be enough. Tomorrow the work would start. The classes, the coaching, the transformation from potential into star. But tonight she could just be, just breathe, just exist, with a contract in her purse, with a new name signed on paper, with a dream within reach, with hope alive, with possibility real, that unwanted foster kids can become stars, that lonely girls can become icons, that transformation is possible, that escape is real, that you can become someone else, someone better, someone chosen, someone enough. Whether that belief was true or false, whether the dream would sustain her or consume her, whether Marilyn Monroe would save her or destroy her, she didn't know yet, couldn't know yet. That was still to come, years ahead, decades ahead, a lifetime ahead. But tonight, this one night, she could just believe, just hope, just dream. And that was enough. More on the early struggles. Let me tell you more about those hard years, those late 1940s when Marilyn was struggling, when the dream was alive but barely, when success seemed possible but always just out of reach. After Fox dropped her in 1948, Marilyn felt that old familiar feeling. Rejection, abandonment, not being enough. It was like being sent away from another foster home, like being told once again that she wasn't wanted, wasn't good enough, wasn't worth keeping. She'd been so close, had a real contract, real training, real opportunities, and then it was gone, taken away. She'd failed, despite trying so hard, despite doing everything right. It hadn't been enough. She hadn't been enough. But she couldn't give up, couldn't accept failure, because giving up meant going back to being Norma Jeane, back to factory work, back to poverty, back to being invisible, and she'd rather die than go back to that. So she kept going, kept trying, kept believing somehow that this wasn't over, that there was still a chance. She kept auditioning everywhere, for everything, any role, any part, anything that might lead somewhere. She'd show up at casting calls with hundreds of other girls, all beautiful, all talented, all desperate, all wanting the same thing, to be chosen, to be the one, to get the part that could change everything. Most times she didn't even get into the room. They'd take one look at the line of girls waiting and cut it down. Too tall, too short, too blonde, too brunette, wrong type, wrong look, wrong everything. Next. Sometimes she'd get in, get to read, get to show what she could do. And usually the response was the same. Thanks, but no thanks. Not quite right. Not what we're looking for. We'll keep you in mind. Which meant no. Always meant no. Columbia picked her up in 1948. Another 6-month contract. She thought maybe this was it. Another chance. Another opportunity. She threw herself into it. Took every class, did everything asked, got cast in a film, Ladies of the Chorus, a low-budget musical. She had an actual part, actual lines, actual songs to sing, but the film flopped. Nobody saw it. Nobody cared. And 6 months later, Columbia dropped her too. Another rejection, another failure, another door closing. She was 22 years old, had been trying for 4 years, had 2 studio contracts that went nowhere, had done dozens of auditions, hundreds probably, had worked so hard, had believed so strongly, and was still nowhere, still nobody, still struggling to pay rent, still unknown, still unwanted. The modeling kept her afloat, barely. She'd do whatever job she could get. Pin-up photos for men's magazines, cheesecake shots, nothing too explicit, nothing nude, not yet, but definitely playing up her sex appeal, her figure, the way men responded to her. It wasn't what she wanted, wasn't acting, wasn't movies, but it paid bills, kept her alive, kept the dream possible, just barely. She lived in cheap apartments, sometimes with roommates to split costs, sometimes alone when she could afford it, which wasn't often. She ate crackers and coffee, lost weight without trying, couldn't afford much else. Spent what money she had on her appearance, on maintaining Marilyn, because Marilyn was her investment, her only asset, her only hope. She went to industry parties, events, premieres, anywhere she might be seen, might make a connection, might meet someone who could help. She'd wear her best dress, the black one, the only good dress she owned, do her makeup perfectly, style her hair, become Marilyn, the confident, sexy, desirable woman, not Norma Jeane, not the scared, broke, desperate girl. Marilyn, always Marilyn. And she'd charm. She'd learned how to make men feel special, important, how to laugh at their jokes even when they weren't funny, how to be interested in what they said even when it bored her, how to make them want her, without being too obvious, without seeming desperate. It was a skill, like acting, like modeling, something she'd learned through trial and error, through necessity, through survival. Sometimes it led somewhere, a date, a connection. Sometimes it led to more, to relationships she didn't want with men who could help her, who had power, influence, who could make calls, open doors, create opportunities. She did what she had to do, what the system required, what every starlet did, the unspoken price, the hidden cost, the way it worked, the way it had always worked, in Hollywood, in life, beauty as currency, sex as transaction, women as commodities. She understood, she participated, she survived. Was it degrading? Yes. Did she hate it? Yes. Did she hate herself for it? Yes. But what choice did she have? This was the world. This was the business. This was how girls like her, girls with no connections, no family, no money, no options, this was how they made it, if they made it at all. She started taking more pills to cope, to sleep, to wake, to function, to keep going. They helped, made things easier, made the hunger less sharp, made the loneliness less crushing, made the self-loathing less overwhelming, made life bearable, barely, but bearable, which was enough, had to be enough. In 1949, desperate for rent money, she posed nude. for a calendar. A photographer she knew offered her $50. $50 for a few hours of work, more than she'd make in a week doing anything else. She needed it. Needed the money. Needed to pay rent. Needed to not get evicted. Needed to survive another month. So she did it. Posed naked for the camera. Let them photograph her body, her curves, everything. She told herself it was just work. Just a job. Just survival. Nothing more, nothing less. But inside she felt shame. Felt cheap. Felt like she'd crossed a line. Like she'd sold something she could never get back. Like she'd become something she'd promised herself she'd never become. The photographs were beautiful, actually. Artistic. Tasteful. As much as nude photographs could be. She looked stunning. The camera loved her naked as much as clothed. Maybe more. All those curves, that luminous skin, that face. But beautiful didn't make it hurt less, didn't make the shame disappear, didn't make her feel better about herself, about what she'd done, about what she'd become. Years later, when she was famous, those photographs would resurface, would cause a scandal, would threaten her career, and she'd have to spin it, explain it, make it seem less than it was, say she needed the money, which was true, say she wasn't ashamed, which was a lie, say it was art, which was partially true but mostly justification. But by then she was Marilyn Monroe, movie star, sex symbol, icon. And icons could survive scandals, could spin narratives, could control their image, could rewrite history. But in 1949, she was just a struggling actress. Another beautiful girl. Nobody. Nothing. Posing nude for $50. Doing what she had to do to survive. To keep the dream alive. To not give up. To believe against all evidence that somehow, someday, this would all be worth it. That success would come. That she'd make it. That Marilyn Monroe would become real. Would become famous. Would become everything Norma Jeane had never been. Wanted. Chosen, loved, enough. Finally, at last, someday. Please God, someday.